Under the arch. Hello? Is this thing on? It's time to sing. Beneath the arch, let heartfelt praises ring. Forsake us not, O mild and moderate goddess. With fair and balanced rhymes we beg your largesse. Help us narrate the story of your knights, and how they braved the unforbidding heights. We sing with measured tones, not high nor low, our tolerance and fairness to extol. Banquet rich for donors great and small, the goddess Fama to St. Louis called, to speak in clever phrases, easy rhymes, as up the social ladder lackeys climb. Post haste they flew o'er land from east and west, hankering to prove their positions the best. Longing for Fama's accepting embrace, they raced to the table, each to their place. Surrounding Famas like flies on fresh meat, they fluttered and fawned and vied for a seat. They dined on foie gras, sipped ice-cold champagne, watching each other to see who'd be named. One cried, "A toast to Fama, our goddess! Jump right on in, no need to be modest." 7 bold knights, with their friends, all jumped up, as scrambling they raced to raise a gold cup. Welcome. I'm Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, and this is The Forge of Tolkien. How many of you have been working on your sub-creations? You remember I said that this video course that we have here on Unauthorized is modeled on the course that I teach at the University of Chicago. And if you were students in my campus course, we wouldn't have had this many episodes together by half as much. It's been a great pleasure this year. This is my year anniversary, I think, of starting to make these videos, sharing my reading of Tolkien with you and meditating on the themes that he's developed in his stories for us. But you guys better have been doing some homework, right? One of the interesting things I realized, I was trying to figure out how to set the videos up for this conversation, and obviously I can't assign you reading. You have to already be doing it, want to be doing it, be inspired to do it. And the other thing I can't do, which I do in my campus course, is give you some writing assignments. And in the campus course, I have a blog where the students write reflections on the conversations that we have in class. And I'm hoping now that Unauthorized TV is going to have live streams, that I can start incorporating some of that, perhaps. I mean, I'd like to do some interviews. I'd like to do some Q&A from you. There's a lot of things that we can do now that we've really laid the groundwork with these first 42 episodes. I have lots and lots and lots more stories to tell for you from Tolkien. We've almost finished the first age. We still have Arundel to think about in detail, and there's always themes to return to and so forth. And then the second age with Numenor and the great Atlantis story and the remaking of the world. We'll have to talk about the shape of the earth. Thus far, you realize we've been dealing with Arda Flat, which should entertain. And then obviously I've been reading for you from The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and talking this year about Tolkien's creative method and the sort of theme of the theology of creation behind his stories, and then showing you the way in which the Silmarillion, his early stories, he creates his own mythology, right? But that's all just backstory to the works that were in fact published in his lifetime, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, which I'm assuming more of you all are familiar with than maybe the Silmarillion or the other stories in the history of Middle-earth. So we've still got a lot to share and a lot to talk about. But this first season, as it were, I've been trying to lay the foundation so that you understand where I'm coming from when, as I asked you in the first episode, sort of what kind of story have we fallen into, and made the argument that what Tolkien is in fact inviting us to do as Christians is recognize ourselves as participants in this great story of creation. And of course, in that great story of creation, we are ourselves called upon to subcreate, right? If you remember, this is from Mythopoeia, the poem that Tolkien wrote for Lewis to encourage him to understand mythology, the poetry of myth making, and poetry here not just in the sense of verse, but in the whole sort of making, right? Poesis is making, so that we make, including in what we call poetry, we make in stories and words images of reality that we incarnate in our spoken, our spoken word and in our writing, is to be participating in the image and likeness in which we were made. And this is the degree to which we are refracting the light of the Creator through our own storytelling. If you remember, this is back from episode 3, I believe. I maybe you all remember exactly which episode I talked about everything. This is from the episode on Mythopoeia when we read this poem in full. Remember that this great claim is behind everything that we've been working on this whole year. The heart of man is not compound of lies, but draws some wisdom from the only wise and still recalls him. Though now long estranged, man is not wholly lost, nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned, and keeps the rags of lordship once he owned, his world dominion by creative act, not his to worship, the great artifact, man, subcreator, the refracted light, through whom is splintered from a single white to many hues and endlessly combined in living shapes that move from mind to mind. Though all the crannies of the world we filled with elves and goblins, though we dared to build gods in their houses out of dark and light, and sow the seed of dragons, 'twas our right, used or misused. The right has not decayed. We make still by the law in which we are made. And Tolkien wrote that, as I said, for Lewis before any of his other stories were published, right? Before The Hobbit was published, before he'd even conceived of writing The Lord of the Rings, which he wrote as the sequel to The Hobbit. During the time, as some of the words that he uses in the poem suggest, that he was already working out his own elvish mythology, his elves and goblins. They're goblins, not orcs yet, although there's orcs, in the stories as well. We're going to have an episode on orcs this time. And saying that we, sub-creators, make in the image and likeness in which we are made, and that his own ambition, which he and Lewis were cultivating in their conversations, in the group that we now call the Inklings, right? They had some other names along the way, but the Inklings is the reading group, right? The reading and writing group, and that they were trying to write the kind of stories that they hoped others would respond to. And when, you'll remember, Tolkien was pitching the publication of The Lord of the Rings to Milton Waldman, one of the things that he claimed was that he was hoping, and this again, it's going back to the beginning of our conversations, to write what he would call a mythology that he could dedicate to England. But in doing that, he didn't imagine that he was going to complete it, as it were, right? He said this is this great sort of manifesto that he gave Waldman, manifesto in the usual Tolkienian self-effacing, both hyperbole and humility. Ordway talks well about that in her Tolkien's Reading book, that he never, not never take Tolkien at his word straight, but the affect with which he presents himself needs to be refracted through his Englishness, right? But he's saying to Waldman, in describing what he had hoped to accomplish with his legendarium, do not laugh. But once upon a time, my crest has long since fallen. No, it hadn't. He still hoped to, but he needs to abase himself because he wants Waldman to publish the books. Waldman didn't. I had a mind to make a body of more or less connected legend, ranging from the large and cosmogonic to the level of romantic fairy story, the larger founded on the lesser, in contact with the earth, the lesser drawing splendor from the vast backcloths, which I could dedicate simply to England, to my country. It should possess the tone and quality that I desired, somewhat cool and clear, to be redolent of our air, the clime and soil of the northwest, meaning Britain and the hither parts of Europe, not Italy or the Aegean, still less the east, and while possessing, if I could achieve it, the fair, elusive beauty that some call Celtic, though it is rarely found in genuine ancient Celtic things, it should be high, purged of the gross, and fit for the more adult mind of a land long now steeped in poetry. I would draw some of the great tales in fullness, and leave many only placed in the scheme and sketched. The cycles should be linked to a majestic whole, yet leave scope for other minds and hands, wielding paint and music and drama. Absurd. Of course, he hoped, one that he says, the vast backcloths, which is saying that's what we've been working with this year, understanding the great backcloths that he was constructing in his own storytelling over the decades and decades before he started writing The Lord of the Rings, so that it has that feeling of depth. It's, of course, the stories actually existed. They were real. There's Beren and Luthien, there's Gondolin, there's Turin, there's the creation story, there's all of the problem of the Silmarils. All of that was this vast backcloth to what became The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And that Tolkien, I mean, he's being modest and grandiose at the same time, right? Saying, I would sketch it all out and then others could come and fill it in. It's like he would be the mythographer for England, creating this sketch. Well, in my campus class, not only would I have had you do lots and lots and lots of reading, which I hope you've been doing anyway, then I've been encouraging you by showing you little pieces to go and explore further in the publications, the actual publications, like Christopher's editions and things like that. But that you would also be invited as your final project to write something or paint something or write some music or cook some Hobbit cookbooks are very popular in the class. That our sense of blandly the appeal, but the majesty of what Tolkien was able to accomplish in his storytelling and his legendarium is that it does invite subcreation. It invites fan fiction, if you will. It invites us to participate in the storytelling that Tolkien and his friends, the Inklings, were trying to invent, recover, make possible in English again. That's a perilous exercise, right? And last week's episode was really long, and if you watch that one, you know, and I'm wrestling with Holly Ordway's book on Tolkien's modern reading, which she says that she wrote because she didn't feel like people believed sufficiently, and she hadn't, that Tolkien read it much in modern literature. And if you are familiar with his letters, particularly, you know, the even just the selection that Carpenter published for us, as well as his scholarship, as well as I mean, there is actually literature out there showing things like the George MacDonald stories and the Rider Haggard and stuff like that. It's not that much of a surprise to say, oh yes, Tolkien was reading a lot of modern literature, but as I talked about last time, it was a surprise for me the specificity of some of the things that Ordway discovered in close reading, the things that Tolkien referenced, and not just the ones that, you know, we expect, but then others that we should have been paying attention to, like John Inglesant, and that passage that I showed you from John Inglesant, where Inglesant is playing the violin and the letter writer is responding to it, and it's like it's so resonant of both the music of creation and that passage at the end of The Lord of the Rings, where you hear the joy and the sorrow blended. Well, that one was a shock because that's one of my favorite passages, but it was as much a shock to find out that Treebird is probably a Sorn. Oh my gosh, I've spent the week like ricocheting around realizing Tolkien lied, no, dissembled, no, wasn't fully honest when he's writing to W.H. Auden, someone he admires, about where he got all his stories, and he's sort of like, oh well, the ants just seem to happen because like I was, as if I was reading somebody else's story. Well, he kind of was, because he was reading C.S. Lewis's Out of the Silent Planet, and there the Sorn doing exactly the same. Oh my goodness. Well, that was bad. And then, of course, rereading She and Rider Haggard's She, Queen Aisha, is probably a model for Galadriel, specifically because the city where she lives is Kor, which Tolkien takes as the name of his original elf city, Cortirion, right? So there's enough hints to find, well, okay, yes, not only did Tolkien read widely in at least modern adventure stories, and he when he's gesturing in Mythopoeia to the different kinds of, oh no, not Mythopoeia, sorry, I've read two and I don't even remember which one my source is anymore. In his letter, in the letter to Milton Waldman, he talks about he wanted to write something ranging from the large and cosmogonic to romantic fairy story, that Tolkien's own compositional practice models the range of sources that he was actually working from, and this is one of the things that I talk with about the students when I'm setting them this final project, this paper. It's like they have a choice. They can write some kind of subcreation, fan fiction or other form of artistic interaction with the legendarium, or, and entirely appropriately, they can write a scholarly paper, because Tolkien did both, right? He both writes scholarly reflections on the process of literature, and on fairy stories that's where we got the title for last week's episode, The Soup of Stories, right? Tolkien thought himself about the process of taking from this repertoire, the soup of stories or the cauldron of stories, this repertoire of tropes and rhetorical devices and images and characters, and they're all sort of simmering there in the tradition, and you take a big ladle out of that soup and you add spices to it and you create your own story, but it's still participating in that. He did both. He thought about it as a scholar, and he tried to write his own. And so I say to the students, well, when you're modeling yourself on Tolkien, you have a very wide range of genres to be working in. You can be working in alliterative poetry. You can be working in iambic pentameter, like Mythopoeia is. You can be working in song. Tolkien had to collaborate with some people like Donald Swann, the songwriter, in order to do the musical compositions that he imagined out of his stories. His wife played the piano, and I think maybe I need to listen to Owen more and play my piano a bit more. I can play both the violin, haha. I can play the fiddle, haha. I can play. I know the notes and things like that. I feel like I'm there with Tolkien, wishing I had the musical facility. What he had, of course, was a linguistic facility, and we've talked about all of that. There's so many ways that you could be sub-creating with Tolkien. But what do you do when you find out that he, in effect, was writing fan fiction? It's like he was writing fan fiction off of the stories that he loved, because, as he and Lewis talked about famously, they couldn't find more of the sort of stories that they wanted. And I'd say that's a very sort of easy definition of fan fiction. That you have a story that you love so much, but you can't find examples of it anywhere else, right? So you start writing in imitation of it, and everyone knows. The entire fantasy, bookseller section is dedicated, in effect, to writing against or with Tolkien, right? Taking, for decades it was always, the new Tolkien. It's like, so he has been the model for, several generations now, 2-3 generations now, of authors writing with him. Well, he was doing the same thing with the stories that he liked, but as he and Lewis famously discussed, they couldn't find enough of the literature that they liked, and so they figured they had to write their own. And that is it. This is one of the passages. It's interesting. Okay, so one of the things that I was frustrated about reading Ordway's book with this, like, Tolkien did or didn't remember that Galadriel is both like the Virgin Mary and she, or he did or didn't remember that Treebeard is, well, one of the Ents from the Ruin, but also basically a Sorn, character that one of his friends invented, or maybe they both invented it, who knows, right? That he's able, in other contexts, to repeat verbatim the same phrase over and over and over again in his letter. So he really, I think he remembered, and he was embarrassed to acknowledge his own creative practice. And that, I think that this sort of embarrassment is part of the problem in Mythopoeia, right? It's like we want somehow in our own creativity to be inventing, de novo, right? It's like, we want, it's a little satanic if you get where I'm going, that if you have this desire to create a story completely independent of all other stories, well, one, you're not going to be able to, because that itself is a trope, and two, it's this pride in thinking that you can you can transcend all other human experience, or that you are not going to humble yourself before the models, the models of the great tradition, but also the great artifact and the maker of that artifact, our creator, in whose image and likeness we are made. That we desire to create is appropriate, Tolkien's saying in Mythopoeia, but this, having to defend it, saying the heart of man is not a compound of lies, but draws some wisdom from the only wise. Our desire for storytelling is not a desire for lying. It's not, fiction is making, it's not lying, but it's appropriate because we're drawing from the wisdom of God, of wisdom, right? And that I think maybe we have to make these apologies because we get embarrassed about our making. It's so funny because I feel kind of embarrassed today because that passage that I read to you at the beginning is obviously not Tolkien. It's meant to be an iambic pentameter. Some of it almost scans, and it's me and my own dragons practicing our subcreation by way of our own poetry, right? And when I was thinking about how best I could answer my frustration with the sort of source hunting exercise from last week, saying, what do you do when you realize that your beloved story has all these sources and you go and find them all? Well, one, okay, fine, you found all of these places where this author whose work you love has borrowed things, but you still don't know where he got it, right? And I think there's a source hunting, which what Ordway was doing is it's a scholarly exercise that has its place, but there's also a kind of grasping preciousness to it, which is problematic, because what is it that you're looking for when you're looking for the things that your favorite author used to write his stories? Well, then I realized I needed to talk to you about the exercise that my group on Telegram has been engaged in over the last year, because I can tell you how we made this poem and where we got the sources and how we refracted them, and how probably if you read this poem you'll find the allusions in it, maybe you'll enjoy them, but can you explain in fact how we came up with this poem simply on the basis of knowing what our models were? And that then becomes the sort of great mystery of what creativity is, and where the stories come from. So there's two problems. Well, there's so one. Here's my homework. I did do my homework, and we're working on. We're in Act 4 of 5 acts in our new poem, the Bear poem, that I've mentioned a few times. This one, Centrism Games, you can buy as a little booklet, which is satisfying to poets. That I have, over the year that I've been making these videos, also been engaged in this practice of trying to write iambic pentameter, and therefore, one, accepting Tolkien's invitation to subcreate, but also the challenge of what can well, okay, I think you can't learn about creative activities unless you actually engage in them. I think criticism by itself is dumb. Right there, I said it. Because without actually engaging in the imitation, in the work, it's I think impossible, and I'm wondering whether this is strong. It's like this is an indictment of academia as much as anything. Can you, if you have not yourself struggled with the materials, understand the achievement of the greatest artists in your tradition? Well, interestingly, within the Western tradition, for some time, people haven't been wanting to do that, right? They've been wanting just to deconstruct, criticize, take apart, and then sit there and look at all of the pieces on the floor. The image that Tolkien used for talking about Beowulf, right? That tower, right? And it's like they've knocked down the tower, either for looking for, you know, historical evidence or, you know, sociological fodder or something like that, or in sort of poor criticism, just taking it down and saying, well, you know, he took a bit from here and he took a bit from there and he took a bit from there. Oh, look, there's, you know, what a muddle it's in. There's no tower. We are in a crisis culturally, and, you know, it's in academia, but in culture more generally, of not even being able to attempt creativity. And obviously the work that I'm doing in these videos and the work that I'm doing in my campus work and in my scholarship, I'm trying to figure out the way out, right? Here at Unauthorized, we're doing lots of things, and the art, you know, the artists for the comic books on Arctoons and the books at Castelli House, everything. It's like, I'm deeply grateful to Vox for creating this platform for us to make within, right? We're making within, and the interesting thing is figuring out why it is. What is it that makes it so hard for modern authors, current, contemporary, like living now authors, to create anything magnificent? Now, Ordway, in her book, in her study of Tolkien and his modern sources, has explained that what she was trying to puzzle out why his book would appeal so much to modern readers, even though the Humphrey Carpenter throwaway thing was, oh, he only read past Chaucer, and she thought the best way to figure out why he still appealed was to show that he actually read a lot in modern literature. I think I mean, I'm grateful for John Inglesant, and she definitely deserves the credit for discovering that as a source. But I think that's kind of putting the cart before the horse. It's the backward problem. Tolkien appeals to modern readers because Tolkien offers something that no other modern literature provides. What was that? Well, C.S. Lewis and he, this is Tolkien writing to Stanley Unwin in 1938. And they're sort of negotiating with Tolkien to write a sequel to The Hobbit, and Lewis is sent out of the Silent Planet to Unwin, and I think they publish it. I'm not quite clear, but Tolkien's writing to Unwin about, well, what was it that he and Lewis were trying to achieve by writing what they did, and explaining, well, it's only an accident that the hero's a philologist. Again, these accidents are a little too convenient, but that the primary exercise was that Lewis was going to write one kind of story and Tolkien was going to write another, but they both participate in the same flavor, as it were. And we talked about this a lot last summer episodes when we talked about the Notion Club papers, and that what Tolkien wrote as his time travel story becomes drafts of the Notion Club paper, the Lost Road and the Notion Club papers. And what Lewis wrote was his space travel story, right? The Out of the Silent Planet with the Sorns that are probably the source for the Ents. Okay, whatever. He says, we originally meant each to write an excursionary thriller, a space journey and a time journey, mine, each discovering myth, right? So as far as Tolkien was concerned, Out of the Silent Planet and The Lost Road, or the Notion Club papers, or what becomes The Lord of the Rings in effect, are meant as the same kind of exercise in discovering myth. But the space journey has been finished and the time journey remains, owing to my slowness and uncertainty, only a fragment, as you know. A few times in subsequent letters, Tolkien explains a bit further about how he and Lewis came to this arrangement, as it were. And this is a letter from later in his life, 1967, 30 years later, when he is reading a draft of an interview that his interviewers have sent him, the Charlotte and Dennis Plimmer, who'd interviewed him for the Daily Telegraph magazine, and he's making comments on some of the things that they put in the interview. And at one place they have him saying, quote, "I'm always looking for something I can't find, something like what I wrote myself. There's nothing like being vain, is there?" All right, so they'd recorded him saying that, and now he's like backtracking and saying, "Oh, okay, an apology for seeming to speak out of vanity. Actually, this arose in humility, my own and Lewis's, the humility of amateurs in a world of great writers. L said to me one day, 'Tollers, there is too little of what we really like in stories. I am afraid we shall have to try and write some ourselves.' We agreed that he should try space travel and I should try time travel. His result is well known. My effort, after a few promising chapters, ran dry. It was too long way round to do what I really wanted to make, a new version of the Atlantis legend. The final scene survives as the downfall of Numenor. This attracted Lewis greatly, as Hurd read, and reference to it occurs in several places in his works, for example, e.g., The Last of the Wine in his poems. We neither of us expected much success as amateurs, and actually Lewis had some difficulty in getting Out of the Silent Planet published. And after all that has happened since, the most lasting pleasure and reward for both of us has been that we provided one another with stories to hear or read that we really liked in large parts. Naturally, neither of us liked all that we found in the other's fiction." So the sort of premise is the storytelling that Lewis and Tolkien were engaged in, and there's a place where Tolkien also talks about Charles Williams, saying that he's talking about the essay on fairy stories that he wrote for Charles Williams. It says, "It remains an unfailing delight to me to find my own belief justified," this is a letter from 1955, "that the fairy story is really an adult genre and one for which a starving audience exists," right? He and Lewis are saying, we want to write the kinds of stories we like, and we can't find any more of them. They don't exist, right? And I would say, for the most part, the modern literature that Ordway catalogs in her book doesn't answer it, right? Otherwise, Tolkien and Lewis would not have started writing. I always think Dorothy Sayers comes close. I mean, I think her Lord Peter Wimsey stories are mythological in a way that Tolkien somehow didn't appreciate, which is frustrating. You know, you want your great authors to like the same things you do. I mean, Rider Haggard creates the sort of feeling of quest for lost cities, but nothing is as good as Tolkien. Truthfully, it's like, it just isn't. You're not going to find it. And that, of course, was the problem that he and Lewis said they were trying to address, that they couldn't find things of the flavor that they enjoyed, and so they had to write them themselves. And as C.S. Lewis said to me once long ago, more or less, I do not suppose my memory of his dicta is any more precisely accurate than his of mine. I often find strange things attributed to me in his works. Interesting. Quote, if they won't write the kinds of books we want to read, we shall have to write them ourselves, right? So what was it that Lewis and Tolkien were missing in the stuff that they found available? Now, recognize that they're not saying, you know, we want to write medieval stories. They're saying there's something missing and there's not enough of it, and we want to have it to read, so we'll write these for ourselves. What was it that they were missing? Well, I do think it's fair to say that it is something that we describe with the words medieval and modern, but that is misleading because it makes it sound like what's missing from the medieval is if you're missing the medieval, it's nostalgic. Nostalgia is a modern phenomenon, very much so, with the feeling of loss, right, which, you know, to a certain extent comes out of things like the Industrial Revolution, because people living through that period were very aware of the transformation of their material world in their own lifetimes. There's been a similar sort of transformation in my lifetime, 50 years, in our electronic world, right, in our publications and our videos, and I mean very much so in the sense that we're moving from a world in which, you know, the massive communication took place in print, in words, to the massive communication taking place in bodies, right? In right now I'm talking to you on a video, right? Instead of writing a book, I'm talking about books, but you need me to be translating in my physical, performative, bodily words, the words that I pick up off the page. Now, I think that's always been true. I think the sort of, you know, frustration that people feel is like oral to literate, and we're going back to oral. Well, even in the great heyday of the romance, you know, in the romance of the 18th century, I guess, and in the novel of the 19th century, people read out loud to each other, right? It's like audiobooks are great now, so you can have someone read it, record it, you listen to it. In the early modern period, we have evidence that, for example, people are sitting, women sitting sewing, or, you know, craftsmen working in their shop. Someone would sit and read to them, and they enjoy the stories, right? This monastic practice going back to, you know, the Middle Ages, that as the monks were eating, they'd have stories read to them. So this sort of strong boundary between the oral and literate it never quite existed, right? But obviously with being able to publish in video, publish my physical lived presence in this moment, it transforms things. The boundary between medieval and modern is therefore not strictly speaking oral versus literate or something like that. So what is it? Well, I like when I work on things and people start sending me stuff, and then I realize this thing that was just sent to me it's like the spirit is working and saying, here now, you need to look at this. That Andrew Thornton Norris wrote to me, having seen one of my videos or one of my Facebook posts. Social media is not bad, all bad, and not even Facebook, where I mentioned that we need iambic pentameter. If we want to save our culture, want to save civilization, if you want to have a civilization, we need iambic pentameter. And I'm really, really not kidding. It's that fundamental. We need to be able to write in meter. Well, he sent me some poetry of his own, but I also learned that he wrote this book, which I recommend, The Spiritual History of English. It's a little essay, and it's a little bit like enfolded and dense, and I recommend it as much for his bibliography as for his argument. That within the English tradition of literature, we have gone through a major transformation from one period to the next. When we say it's medieval to modern, that is temporally, chronologically accurate. But the transformation that's taken place is, I'm trying to make sure that you don't just fall into saying medieval and modern, medieval and modern. And it's like modernism as such was actually an answer to the part of the problem, and therefore we are in as a postmodern. Don't worry about these labels. The transformation is from an ontological view of reality, a being, right? We're worrying about the beingness, to a psychological view. We've gone from a culture, a long tradition, philosophical, theological, in which, and this happens in literature, but what I like about what Thornton Norris does is show you that it's like literature is the incarnation of a culture. I think he gets that from C.S. Lewis, or maybe he gets it from George Steiner. See, though I said, no, that's Steiner is about how a belief in God is essential to creativity. That literature is the incarnation of the culture, the making, and literature, the written word, is Thornton Norris talks about how it's fundamentally intellectual, right? You have to strip out all of the things that I'm able to do in this video, wave my arms around, use the intonation of my voice, use my face, use all of that bodily communication. When you're writing, you're stripping out everything of the physical, sensational world and putting that all into words. Which is why it's so hard. You think about it, right? Why is writing so hard? It's this distillation, right? If you think about it as alchemical and in that powerful sense, you are refining and refining and refining down till you get the absolute perfect phrasing, ideally in poetry, right? You've done it to the point where you've chosen the word that fits in this exact place. It's an incredible discipline to make sure that you are structuring your thought beautifully and correctly. And what Thornton Norris argues, and he's using a lot of T.S. Eliot here, which is appropriate for Tolkien, because Tolkien, I think, was very sympathetic to Eliot. Sorry, I just forgot what I was saying. Aren't you pleased that I record these and then you can go back and listen again? And it's like, where was she going with that? We're refining it down into the words. You're refining. And I'm just gonna have to start over. The incarnation of the language is what happens in literature, and what we've lost in modernity is this attempt to show the relationship of things to the transcendent, this ontology of heaven and earth. We've lost that, and what we are left with, and Thornton Norris points out it's due to Protestantism, it's the subjectiveness of thinking. What we're left with is simply one emotional response, so that basically all modern literature is romantic in the capital R sense of it's about feelings and expressiveness, and also with the corollary of all art is considered sort of the basis of spirituality, right? You're supposed to go to a museum and have religious experiences, well, spiritual experiences, by looking at canvases or something like that. That we've stripped out the claim that literature, and visual arts as well, but literature is pointing to something beyond the merely material world, and we're left with nothing but our subjectivity. Maybe I haven't made that clear. Perhaps a passage will help. So he's talking about the problem of what happened with Protestantism and Puritanism. And I'd say this is, if you want the great break between medieval and modern, it's the Reformation and the 16th century, and the humanistic focus on the well, one, the conscience and the subject, but two, the rejection of this transcendent understanding. So, for example, the rationalism that is associated with Puritanism and the rejection of ecclesiastical Christianity or ancient pagan religion does not destroy the human need for belief, the religious sense. What it does is to translate it into political or other modern world immanent causes such as socialism or liberalism or humanitarianism, or alternatively into superstitions such as spiritualism and other New Age, Hermetic, or esoteric phenomena such as Kabbalah or horoscopes. Right? So we get this rationalism that breaks apart the world, and it goes into either the materialist or the spiritualist in the woo-woo sense, right? The sort of crazy. And this, as Thornton Norris is trying to show, and I think Tolkien and Lewis are working within, is breaking apart an understanding that was, persistent throughout the Middle Ages, that symbolism actually points to something, right? So he's relying here on Ernst Curtius's European Literature in the Latin Middle Ages, and Curtius showing that this creative symbiosis of Greek and Latin literature with the scriptures is what makes the Western tradition distinctive. But this is lost, right? And it's particularly lost from the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, which was the consequence of Puritanism and latitudinarianism, was the means by which paganism was revived. But the consequence of this was not a classical literature, for this was not based on revival of the pagan religions of Greece and Rome, but Romanticism, and before it, Neoclassicism. Rationalism bred irrationalism. While the Enlightenment dreamt that reason would rid the world of superstition and priests, in fact it encouraged them, through the new priesthood of writers, proclaimers of liberty and other earthly doctrines, and the gurus of the new post-Christian age. Continuing. The Enlightenment, which was supposed to be a response to the intellectual darkness of revealed religion, liberated modern Europe from the Latin classical tradition as the Reformation did for ecclesiastical Christianity. This is the process we shall see in the development of literary movements, which are both artistic movements and incarnations of post-ecclesiastical Christian doctrines. The Enlightenment, which was supposed to be a liberation from the intellectual darkness of revealed religion, became a re-enslavement to paganism, first of the political heaven-on-earth variety, such as led to the French and American revolutions, Nazism, and communism, and second, of the superstitious, supernatural, or individualistic variety that were the consequence of these creeds. When people were free to believe anything they wanted, they would do just that. Reason became the vehicle by which the intellectual darkness of a new paganism was loosed on the modern world, whether it took a collectivist or individualist form. Its literary incarnation was first neoclassical, then romantic, modernist, then postmodernist. Okay. Like I said, it's I recommend it, but you have to really pay attention and read through it and maybe sort of chew over the references a bit. The general argument is the rationalism of the Enlightenment is the problem that we're facing, right? If you want modernity, which is enlightened modernity, it is in service of a superstitious paganism that is utterly, materialistic, but also, in fact, weirdly enough, irrational in its, sort of embrace of everything except the ordered theology of Christianity. Definition of romanticism, and this is you say, Tolkien is not really Tolkien and Lewis are not romantic for reading the fairy stories that they are. They are, in Eliot's terms, modernist, because T.S. Eliot as a modernist is actually trying to recover some sense of this ontological reality. What they're reacting against, and I think they dislike, is the psychologizing of art, the, sort of making the aesthetic the source of spirituality that Romanticism does. So let me see if you can keep up with this. It's still kind of, I read this like this weekend, so it's still really folded in my understanding. Romanticism is the underlying condition of literature and the other arts in a modern society. In such a society, the dominant metaphysics is that of the religion of individual conscience, the result of Cartesianism and Lutheranism, which result in the politics of liberty and human rights. Voltaire, Rousseau, and the Founding Fathers. I should say Thornton Norris is English, but recognize this isn't about, the problem with Americanism. This is a problem with modernity and its focus on the individual, both politically and psychologically. The religion of the individual conscience is the freedom to believe whatever you want and to do anything you want so long as it doesn't harm others. Sound familiar? In practice, this means belief in anything and everything, from health to wealth to well-being, from stars to stones to spirits, from self to other to society, from nothing in particular to nothing at all. As we have seen, without conversion to another religion, however, these are but an extreme form of Protestantism, glorifying elements either of the historic tradition or particular heresies associated with it. The attempt to establish a pure materialism or rationalism is subverted by the innate religious tendencies of human nature. Materialism becomes a religion, and rationalism becomes the means by which paganism is reintroduced when Christianity is lost. But this rebirth of paganism does not mean the rebirth of the tradition, for tradition has become identified with the Latin classical tradition, while paganism and Protestantism are identified with Romanticism. It is not therefore metaphysics, but psychology that is incarnate in literature and the other arts. It is skeptical of the existence and so the authority of anything outside one's own mind, but it becomes self-defeating. It deconstructs itself. The logical conclusion of this is postmodernism, skepticism about the Enlightenment itself, the ability of reason to provide access to truth. The consequence is the solipsism and existentialism of Beckett, Sartre, Camus, or Houellebecq, and the nihilism of the destruction of literature in English. But Romanticism was less a reaction to the Enlightenment than an attitude concealed within it. It is a realignment of values so that art, rather than the divine, is the starting place of the quest for knowledge. Kant even derived his theology from his aesthetics, quote, using aesthetic judgment as the proof of God. Okay, so what I'm taking from that and wanting you to think about is the contrast that I see Lewis and Tolkien participating in is that this frustration that the kind of literature they want, myth, is metaphysical, right? They want the literature that they're reading to participate in what Tolkien describes in Mythopoeia, right? We want to be participating in this subcreation, and the legendarium, the mythology that he's working with, he wants it to be real, right? Really real. And saying he preferred history to allegory. He wants it grounded in truth, which is a metaphysical truth, not simply a subjective psychological truth, which ends up with, where we are with the things like the, multiple, genders and sexualities and so forth, but also in our political world, that there is no truth that we are grounded in at all in any context except for power. And your ability to exercise power over somebody else to either accept your vision of reality or be enslaved. And to think about, that what Tolkien writes most about in The Lord of the Rings is that desire that Sauron has to enslave all other wills. That Tolkien is writing for our freedom, but it's freedom within the metaphysical reality that we are creatures made in the image and likeness of a maker. Now, Thornton Norris ends up is that we have no English literature left, right? He says that he concludes with talking about magic realism and the problem with, you know, the English literary tradition is gone, dead, died, wiped out. And in Thornton Norris's argument, it's because, I mean, the only way back, he's writing this during Pope Benedict XVI's papacy, so I don't know what he's saying right now about Francis. I'll need to ask him. That it's only within the Catholic tradition that we can recover this. I say it's deeper than that. I mean, the papal tradition, we can argue about that. You know that Milo and I have written against the current pope and his particular ideologies. From my perspective, I'm grounded in the literature of the Christian Middle Ages, grounded in the medieval literature that Tolkien was reading, and grounded in Tolkien, my own grounding in Tolkien. I see the hope for us in iambic pentameter, which is grounding our creativity in that structured tradition that sees a sort of order in the world and wants to participate in it. Now, what's interesting about postmodern literature, one, I said earlier, we have this academic culture in which nothing, it's nothing but criticism, it's nothing but taking things apart, and you end up with nothing but that tower, the tower with the rocks everywhere and no meaning. Or in the postmodern condition, since there's no appreciation for the way in which a literature can point to reality, and modern literature doesn't even point to reality external to the psychology of the characters of the author, that we end up with this nihilism or simply irony, right? The last gasp of our literary tradition was ironic, and now if we have anything left, it's, I guess modern movies have, like the superhero movies have all descended into parody isn't even it. It's they're not even self-parodying, right? Because that would at least be ironic and amusing. They're just parasitic and destructive. If we're going to make still in the image in which, make still by the law in which we were made, and to accept Tolkien's invitation to subcreate within his legendarium, we need to a certain extent accept the reality in which he was writing, and that he thought that we could recover through fairy stories, right? How would we write poetry in a postmodern world? Well, we can't. There's nothing there. So can we write anything? What do we do? How do we rediscover a metaphysical reality? Through stories. And also through imitation, right? The humbling ourselves in imitation to the kinds of stories that we like, right? It's like writing fan fiction is in fact what the entire Western tradition did until modernity. And that medieval literature is all fan fiction off this book. That the reason I think the commentaries on scripture that I read are actually often, in the Marian tradition, they're often making their own narratives, right? That they're inventing this way of being inside of the story with Christ and Mary through, for example, commentary on the Song of Songs. But that even commentary becomes fan fiction shows you the power of immersing yourself in that model. And that, interestingly enough, and I think this is also to appreciate why Tolkien is in fact truly creative, but not in the sense of he made it all up out of nothing, and therefore he's this inspired genius, right? The romantic version of where artistic creativity comes from. That the closer you work with models within this Christian classical Latin European tradition, but it works off of other traditions as well. But if we want the kind of stories that Tolkien and Lewis loved, you're modeling yourself on the kinds of stories that take the scriptures as their own model, right? So it's this ramifying fan fiction, and it's by that practice of imitation that you in fact discover your own the way in which you are refracting the light of the creators, the light of the creator. And what's very, very interesting is the closer you model yourself on God, the more individual you become. It's a wonderful sort of paradox. Like modernity, you think about, we are all individuals. We all want to be unique. The more you try satanically to assert your absolute individuality, the more you, in fact, have none, right? You're just modeling yourself on Satan's rebellion. Well, okay, so I said that I could the best example I could come up with in process terms was centrism games, because I can tell you about how we made it, and therefore make some more specific contrast with exactly what we were. It's like how we transform the models, and we're very consciously working with models and realizing the degree to which our story depended on them, but it's still its own story, which is what we become as Christians in our lives, modeling ourselves on Christ, right? Well, what were our models, right? We in the 20th century are not the first ones to complain that nobody is writing anything any good. You may have heard the phrase, "a little learning is a dangerous thing." Do you know where it comes from? And you know who the poet is, and it's in iambic pentameter too, right? You should expect that now, because this entire episode is in iambic pentameter, from Mythopoeia to Centrism Games to Alexander Pope, who in his essay on criticism, which is where that passage, "a little learning is a dangerous thing," comes from, is complaining in the early 18th century, so he's not a new problem. Was that 300 years ago? 1728, 18, 19, 20. 300 years ago, making exactly the same complaint that we are now, that everybody in the sort of literary world is incapable of criticizing something to appreciate it, I think is what he's doing. And he wrote the essay on criticism, became famous for it in 1711. He became famous for it in a way as an attack on his own contemporaries. He was Catholic too, so I was reading, we wanted to read Alexander Pope because I needed a good model, and I knew he was a great master of iambic pentameter, but then I realized he was also topical to our problem, and that here in the passage from an essay on criticism, where that "a little learning is a dangerous thing" comes in, he's talking about the hindrances to proper judgment of literary excellence. Here's the first one. "Of all the causes which conspire to blind man's erring judgment and misguide the mind, what the weak head with strongest bias rules is pride, the never-failing vice of fools. Whatever nature has in worth denied, she gives in large recruits of needful pride, for as in bodies thus in souls we find what once in blood and spirit swelled with wind. Pride, where wit fails, steps into our defense, and fills up all the mighty void of sense. If once right reason drives that cloud away, truth breaks upon us with resistless day. Trust not yourself, but your defects to know. Make use of every friend and every foe. A little learning is a dangerous thing. Drink deep, or taste not the Pyrean spring. There shallow draughts intoxicate the brain, and drinking largely sobers us again. Fired at first sight with what the muse imparts, in fearless youth we tempt the heights of art, while from the bounded level of our minds short views we take, nor see the lengths behind. But more advanced, behold with strange surprise new distant scenes of endless science rise. So pleased at first the towering Alps we try, mount over the vales and seem to tread the sky. The eternal snows appear already past, and the first clouds and mountains seem the last. But those attained, we tremble to survey the growing labors of the lengthened way. The increasing prospect tires our wandering eyes. Hills peep over hills, and Alps on Alps arise. Okay, so the second half of that passage, this is Alexander Pope's An Essay in Criticism. He's a Catholic poet from the early 18th century, criticizing his own contemporaries for being too proud to draw on tradition. Now, one, that should be coming. He's 300 years. We've been fighting this fight for a while against modernity and against pride and against the unwillingness to humble ourselves before other authors. I mean, not just other authors. That's a pale way of saying. You say make use of every friend and every foe, but recognize that you need to read a lot, take in a lot of different models, take in a lot of different examples, which you can see what Tolkien was doing, right? It's like his books are made of lots and lots and lots of other books. You do not become a writer ever without having read extensively, because you need to know how we use our craft. You need to know how we use the words. We need to know how you use the stories and the ideas. But what happens over that sort of immersion in the tradition is you are then, in fact, constantly, it's like the soup, the cauldron of stories. I mean, I'm thinking of a Terry Pratchett thing from the library. It's like books write each other, right? It's like all of the other books are responding and speaking. You're in this giant conversation that it's interesting. I mean, the problem in education now, quite literally the problem in education now, is one, we're not reading Alexander Pope, never mind Tolkien, but we're not reading the tradition. We're simply being told that it's all racist, which you can see is pride. Never mind, pride in the 18th century just meant they were writing their own stuff and being proud of it. But now pride, you can see why the pride parades, our pride month is such as pride means you are never acknowledging your place in this grand landscape. And I like the little learning I've used. It's my own mantra for a long time, because it's also a description of, you start out when you're young and you read and you think you know everything. It's like, it fired at first sight with what the muse imparts. In fearless youth we tempt the heights of arts, and think, oh, look how far we've come. And then you get to the top of the first mountain and there's more and more Alps, right? I also like it, going back to our Gondolin episode, where Tolkien went on his great alpine trek with his aunt, right, and his brother and their friends, and that turned into a story. That what I'm talking to you through right now is the way I use Alexander Pope, right? It's saying, I read this, it's clearly much more beautifully written than our iambic pentameter. I needed him as a model. We started reading the Essay on Criticism simply because I needed him as a model. And then I realized that the poem itself was teaching us the things we needed to know about the fight that we were in. Step one. All right. So I went to the poem simply as a model of good iambic pentameter, and then it started to say, aha, the poems that Pope wrote were themselves about the problem that we are addressing, which then made me think, oh, well, we should read another of his very famous works, which is the Dunciad, which is his own coinage. And it's like, like the Confederacy of Dunces, but the Dunciad is all about, again, Pope was a little frustrated and bitter and physically unlovely. And so, he had a kind of friendship relationship with Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who then humiliated him with her publications. So whatever is going on in here, he's transforming it into his beautiful lines. And in the Dunciad, which he dedicated to Jonathan Swift, the great satirist, the author of Gulliver's Travels, he is again showing the way in which his contemporaries, the early 18th century writers, you think of, if you're worrying about, when is the great period of English literature, early 18th century, you would often think, oh, isn't that it? And there's Jonathan Swift writing Gulliver's Travels, and you have, you haven't even had the whole 19th century worth of novels, and Pope is considering it's already all, corrupted and dead. The problem that he sees is, guess what? The journalists are all writing for money. Yes, that's. I mean, seriously, it's truthfully that simple. I did a blog post on Fencing Bear Prayer called Dunciad 2020, and I'm setting up what we were trying to do in our poem. Right here it is. Alexander Pope, 1688 to 1744, was not happy. For years, he had labored to craft polished pentameters in English, astonishing the reading public of the early 18th century with the precision of his meter and rhyme. A little learning is a dangerous thing, he warned them in his precocious An Essay on Criticism, 1711. Drink deep or taste not the Pyrenean spring, their shallow draughts intoxicate the brain, and drinking largely sobers us again. But none of his contemporaries, in Pope's view, wanted to drink deep of the springs of learning. They paddled about in the shallows, producing derivative dull works, jumbling together tragedy and comedy, epic and farce, mixing their metaphors, and using rhyme to create monstrosities, not beauties of verse. Rather than serving the muses of history and poetry, they scribbled at the feet of the goddess Dullness, churning out journals, medleys, mercuries, and magazines, ephemera as soon forgotten as published, their only virtue to have earned their authors a few coins. Okay, so this is on Fencing Bear Prayer. And the blog post is Dunciad 2020. Setting it up, saying Pope is upset that the people in the writers in his own day are doing it simply for money. And he's, concerned about things like they're mixing up genres, they're churning out these like journals, medleys, mercuries, and magazines, right? They're writing nothing but ephemera. There's no great literature. Why does this sound so familiar? Postmodernism is a problem. Andrew Thornton Norris would say, well, it's of course there's a problem for Pope. He's still writing in the post-Protestant period, so we're fighting 500 years. But in any case, it's not new, and you could say it's not new because the challenge is always the same. We're always having to humble ourselves before the great maker and not be satanic in our refusal to make well. But anyway, so what happens in the Dunciad is the goddess Dullness holds court and seduces the poets away from actual learning to compete in meaningless games. I'm saying, okay, I think that's, you can read the rest of this. The games is where we started, right? So we're reading the Dunciad, and my poets are recognizing one. It's a little hard to get used to the iambic pentameter, but then when they figured out what he was saying, they say, oh, he's describing the problems that we're facing now. And then I was like, oh, we could write our own, right? So you're starting to see where the centrism games part came. And then it starts playing out, all right? So we have Alexander Pope is writing about what he's frustrated with in his own day. It's a satire. He's criticizing contemporary writers for serving the goddess Dullness. Which goddess do we serve now? Well, interestingly, Thornton Norris pointed to it, although this is not where I got it because I just found out. So, who do we serve in the present, in the Romantic period? The consequence for cultural values is that the individual artist or individual taste becomes sovereign, de gustibus non est disputandum. Authority is gained through popularity, the accumulation of individual preferences. Authority is gained through popularity, accumulation of individual preferences. Authority is gained through popularity. We serve fame. And that's what we realized in centrism games are, we were saying we can, dullness seemed a bit dull. What is the goddess that we find modern authors, politicians, Hollywood actors, priesthood, everyone serves fame, and that's where our goddess starts in System Game. A banquet rich for donors great and small, money. The goddess Fama, to St. Louis called. St. Louis because it's at the center of the country, so we're playing with the centrism. Just and they all want to be there. They all come from east to west to be in the court. If the goddess of 1728 was dullness, the goddess of 2020 is Fama, the all-consuming desire for attention, whether it comes from celebrity or social media, peer review, or politics. Our media pretends to be at daggers drawn over the differences between left and right, but in truth, everyone in public life serves the center, real or perceived. Even as they fling poo at each other for being deplorables or racists, their real audience is each other, the great Dunciad of the overeducated elite. Whether they pretend to serve the Constitution or social justice, tradition or transformation, the competition is as fake as the game's dullness proposed. Thus the propensity on the so-called right to cuck and on the soi-disant left to virtue signal. Everything depends on the favor of Fama, who like dullness, quote, tinseled ore in robes of varying hues with self-applause her wild creation views. That's Pope, right? Fama's sycophants crawl to her throne, desperate for her favor, while she sees, quote, momentary monsters rise and fall, and with her own fool's colors gilds them all. So we have, there's a meta level that I'm trying to sustain here, which is we are invited to subcreate. The frustration that Tolkien and Lewis have is finding stories that they like of their own. My frustration in setting up, sort of my poetry exercises was having nothing in modern literature. I really dislike modern poetry, but now I have an appreciation of why, and I'm starting to be able to articulate that too. And two, by the exercise of trying to write centrism games and now Aurora Borealis, I'm getting to the point where I can truly appreciate when a poet has really gotten it right. It's like when you wrestled with it yourself and come up with okay lines like we did, you deeply, deeply appreciate the accomplishment of a truly great poet who has the exact right word choices in every place, right? The meta level is how this process was happening, and I'm describing to you all of the ways. It's like we were reading Alexander Pope, which then got us into thinking about his themes, which then gave us the theme of the centrism games, and that's what there's an epigraph to the poem in the book. And now the queen to glad her sons proclaims by Harold Hawker's high heroic games, which is where we got the games. And in Dunciad, in Pope's Dunciad, they do various ridiculous activities. The goddess is first pleased for disport to propose games to the booksellers, and setteth up the phantom of a poet, which they contend to overtake. The races described with their diverse accidents. Next, the game for a poetess. Then follow the exercise for the poets of tickling, vociferating, diving, and the last game is pretty funny because they there's two works, two voluminous authors, one in verse and the other prose, that are read out loud, and everybody has to stay awake, and of course they all fall asleep because it's so boring, right? So we took that idea of the games, idea of the goddess, translated it into a contemporary situation with still modeled on the concerns that Pope had. Say, what kinds of courtiers would we have for our goddess, Fama, and what kinds of games would they propose? Okay, so that was one layer, saying we're using Pope. Well, there was a second major problem that we needed like a plot, a disruption, a purpose, and a quest. Pope was one, our sort of modern model, although 18th century. But then we also had medieval model, just Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is one of the poems that Tolkien knew very well, that I've talked to you about in some episodes ago, because the Green Knight is the background for the Ents, other than Lewis's Sorns, right? That the Green Knight, as his challenger, comes to King Arthur's court. I said Pentecost in a recent episode. It's not. It's Christmas. A recent different episode. The Green Knight comes to the Christmas court that Arthur's holding, and Arthur has this tradition saying he's not going to eat until there's has some entertainment. And here comes the Green Knight and proposes this competition of chopping his head off with exchange of blows, right? So our centrism games, which is why in the cover it's green, right? And for envy too, and pride and prominence, stuff like there's the greenness of the envy of all the courtiers who are going to compete for this prize, but the Green Knight is our disruptor, so that here Fama is holding her court, and in the opening scene I read to you, the knights get up and they're all going to like toast her, right? They all jumped up and raised a gold cup, and they all hail her. The character that I helped co-write was the lady priest, right? So here's her toast to Fama. All hail our mother goddess without peer, with bread and wine unblessed she brings great cheer. To serve her I gave up no wealth, no hearth, her mysteries in the fateful stars I chart. All faiths converge in her perennial truth, I choose no card, but only follow suit. Christian, Muslim, Jew, it makes no matter, the lady priest intoned with broad laughter. So in that I'm playing off of Mother Goddess, which feminist theologians often point to, bread and wine unblessed, so we're not participating in the Eucharist. I didn't give up anything, wealth or home, so claim that women can have everything, right? Her mysteries in the fateful chart, stars I chart, that we have astrology and fate, and we can chart that out. All faiths converge in her perennial truth, that the lady priest wants to be all religions, right? So she chooses no actual theology. I choose no card, but only follow suit. So I'm just going to follow what everybody else is playing, because it makes no matter, Christian, Muslim, or Jew. And broad laughter is meant to be like the broad church that she's apparently joyful in. For that character, we used some of those TikTok videos of the priests and doing dances showing their rainbow LGBT openness, broadness, which did come into another of the characters. Right, okay, so they all give the toasts, and they're all wanting to impress Fama and get her favor, and therefore be recognized and popular, right? And as Thornton Norris says, in this romantic moment of psychology and subjectivity, authority is gained through popularity, the accumulation of individual preferences. You can see that in our social media culture, where everything is fed through how many likes you get, right? So our courtiers at Fama's court want to get their likes, and then the Green Knight shows up. The toasts were done in stanza 13, which I guess is appropriate. The toasts were done, the feast begun, when lo, some uninvited guests perturbed the show, in crept a stench that made all clutch their pearls. For coming was a band of lads, no girls. They proudly clamored, cheered, and gaily played. True men at arms, none were neutered or spayed. They came in every color from every place, but one was oddly greenish of the face. A hawk of white on his lapel did shine, a wizened face, a beard with breath of wine. Almost medieval in his disposition, stoutness of heart propelled him on his mission. He had no patience for this kind of party, all pretense without meaning, far too arty. Though imperfections dotted all his frame, he spoke at once, like one not courting fame. His words he like a fishing line did cast. Character is the only thing that lasts. The crowd, aghast, tried hard to stop their ears. I'm only mad when someone interferes. I strive, but you all pray to some fake goddess. They slithered, hissed, and coiled, their wills a potus. His band of brothers roared and stood their ground while his words continued to resound. Do you recognize him? So this is, I'm saying, we modeled all of this on the Dunciad and then threw in the Green Knight as the character that comes and disrupts the court. But our Green Knight had an actual model as well, and when we realized that it was in the name of the Gawain character, the man that we had used, that we'd modeled our Gawain on, his name was actually Gawain, only Gavin, then we started sort of freaking out. It's like, where does all this creativity come from, right? And that is, I mean, what's interesting is you can feel that happening and saying, we did not plan that this made sense, and yet then when we saw that the association was there, it did make sense. So I do forgive Tolkien when he seems not to know where everything comes from, that when you're playing off of models, you think of the model and realize it's more appropriate than you thought for other reasons. So maybe he did, he made up the Ents, he liked the sort of giant character that Lewis had invented, and then realized that, oh well, but I know that word from that poem, and it's probably because I also like Shakespeare, but I don't really know where it all came from. I have had that experience in working on this poem, so I do get what Tolkien was describing, right? Well, it's Gavin McInnes, which is sort of interesting. So we read his own book, his own autobiography, and then we're modeling our Green Knight, who is disruptive, wild. The Green Knight in the Sir Gawain in the Green Knight is more courteous, right? He plays by the rules. Our Gawain is playing by the rules and being disruptive in a different way, accompanied by his band of men, right? The disruptive men. And some of the things that I read in stanza 15, that character is the only thing that lasts, I believe, is paraphrasing him. Yes, fame is fleeting, he burps. In our character. Popularity and accident, riches take wings, only one thing endures, character. So we're paraphrasing our source there, and also, I'm only mad when someone interferes. Yes, I never complained about people not giving me opportunities. The only time I got mad was when someone stood in my way. You could, therefore, take our poem, Centrism Games, and go and look for the sources that we use to write it, right? I say it's a Dunciad. We say it's a modern Dunciad. And I say that it's Alexander Pope. We do not say directly in this that we're using Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. You just have to recognize that allusion. You would have to know Gavin McInnes's own words fairly carefully, probably, to recognize these as paraphrases. But once I show you that they're paraphrases, you're like, oh, okay, they're just paraphrasing. Did we make it up? Is it new? I mean, so indeed it is, and you're going to have to buy the book to find out what happens in the story. The Green Knight makes everybody angry, and they're horrified, and Fama sends them off on a quest for which she promises a prize, a golden mask, right? She says this is her sending them out on the quest. I guess she's saying, are you going to choose him and recognize his challenge as appropriate, or are you going to follow me and serve me, and follow along with the modernist recognition of laissez-faire and free market and popularity, right? So to arms, she cried, the world lies at your feet. No conscience needed, just your self-conceit. Our master Smith knew that opinion rules, just like our forefathers taught us in school. What gold, what fame, le monde va, I should be able to read. What gold, what fame, le monde va du le même. All you need do is seek la crème de la crème. And if any time you rise to fame, remember to put someone else to shame. That's Adam Smith talking about, this theory of moral sentiments, that our morality now is based on how we feel. Moral feelings, right? It's like, fuck your feelings, excuse me. we need to go back to Adam Smith and recognize that modernity is based on that claim that you recognize morality through your sentiments, your feelings. Okay, so Fama sends them off on a quest, and we have 5 knights, 5 characters who are proving themselves incapable of resisting the desire to serve the center, serve fame. The Lady Priest was really fun to write. If I have told you, I've told you explicitly how we figured out the model and the source and so forth, at what point do you decide, as for example with Tolkien and Lewis, that because we had a model, we were writing fan fiction or exercising our creativity, participating in the stories, participating in the tropes? I say the reason that Lewis and Tolkien had to write their own stories was because they needed to be writing within the tradition that recognized truth. And it was frustrating for them reading modern literature that was simply about the romantic, elevation of art, which was not what they were about, even though what they talk about all the time is the need for our recognition of ourselves as makers and artists. Which is what writing fairy stories is ultimately all about, right? That if what we want to do in modern literature or current literature, the literature that we write now, and write the kinds of stories that we like reading when we read Tolkien, it's not about writing fantasy in the sense of making up a Never Never Land that we want to escape to. But as Tolkien said in his essay on fairy stories, it's about recovering the wonder of the world that we actually inhabit, getting this clear view. So that fantasy is made out of the primary world, but a good craftsman loves his material and has a knowledge and feeling for clay, stone, and wood which only the art of making can give. By the forging of Graham, cold iron was revealed. By the making of Pegasus, horses were ennobled. In the trees of the sun and moon, root and stock, flower and fruit are manifested in glory. Fantasy is made out of the primary world, but a good craftsman loves his material and has a knowledge of and feeling for clay, stone, and wood, which only the art of making can give. If you want, this is actually a fun realization, right? If you want to understand Tolkien's stories, you need to practice writing your own. Now, if that is not the best invitation to writing fanfic I can come up with, I'm not sure what else I could say. We make still by the law in which we're made. Time to go out. Try your own hand at iambic pentameter. The dragons in the Dragon Common Room are continuing to work on our bear story, The Quest for the Light. With the Centrism games, we were writing a satire and modeled on Alexander Pope, and the frustration that we have with, in fact, not having the literature that we enjoy reading. With Aurora Borealis, we are entering further into this desire to write in Tolkien's mode of storytelling and showing the reality of the materials out of which our habitation, this Middle Earth, is constructed. If you're curious about that, it'll be coming soon, hopefully by the end of the summer, and it will be our project in this next year to encourage each other to continue to work in Tolkien's mode of making. Thank you for joining me. To be continued.